let's talk about Canada's future. I'll get your opinion. Let's start with British Columbia and then move to Alberta for now. Like the NDP, the Socialists, for all those you who are listening internationally, the Socialists were elected again in British Columbia in the last provincial election, although by a hair's breadth. The Conservatives made a charging comeback and are serving at minimum as a credible opposition now. So tell me about British Columbia, tell me about Alberta, and then let's turn our attention to federal politics.
Okay, I probably know less about British Columbia and Alberta than I do about Syria and Afghanistan. A little bit about Canada, a little bit about the United States. In British Columbia, the interesting thing is that the New Democrats, which is like the establishment party, really, it's in British Columbia, I don't know, socialist, liberal, conservative, whatever, it's the establishment, was challenged very, very, very seriously by an upstart party. Basically, they just said, we'll put conservative in the brand. Mm-hmm. And that was enough to almost chase the New Democrats.
I interviewed John Rustad in the lead up to the provincial election.
What do you make of him? He seems like a regular guy. I don't know.
I liked him. I thought he conducted himself very well in the course of a 2-hour podcast. So his intellectual ability wasn't exhausted by the format, which is a good start. I thought he was very solid and sensible and smart, and I thought he was in it for the right reasons. I mean, he's an older guy. There's no narcissism in John Rustad, I mean, there's nothing in it for him personally, really. He felt that British Columbia was being terribly mismanaged and he had a fair bit of management experience and felt that he could do a much better job. And that seems to me to be
I have to say, I regret to say, I don't see much to be inspired by in the political class in British Columbia, or even I regret to say this because I don't want to be mean to Pierre Poilievre, but his housing policy is essentially the same as the housing policy of the province of British Columbia, the New Democrats. Build, 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 build. And also, get rid of the gatekeepers, whoever these people are, and basically force municipal governments to adopt essentially open zoning, the end of single-family residential zoning. That is essentially the position of the Conservative Party federally. It's the position of the provincial government here in British Columbia. They've essentially removed any democratic control over zoning locally. And here's the paradox. Poilievre is, he's a lovely guy. He's a reedy little fellow. The way I've described him is he strikes one as somebody might have spent a little bit too much time playing with his Buzz Lightyear action figures when he was a kid. He's been in politics his whole life. Everybody wishes him well. I wish him well because he's going to be the guy. And, one hopes that he will succeed. But if you take the case of Vancouver, there are 3 times as many residential units within the city limits of Vancouver as there were in the 1970s. Build. And yet Vancouver is the most expensive city in North America. The laws of supply and demand do not work in the way a lot of people seem to think they do. The problem is not the cost of housing, it's the cost of land. And Adam Smith was aware of this and the degree to which it is a natural function of the landlord to usurp the wealth produced by the relationship between the workers and the capitalists. That's what's happening in Canada, and it's really complicated. Nobody wants to deal with it because nobody wants to see the value of their property shrink. And so
that's a big problem with regards to driving the cost of housing down. Especially if that's done precipitously, because so many people have all their wealth, their retirement wealth, for example, essentially stored in their house. So here's the difficulty, and I think this is another thing that we really didn't talk about when we talked about this sort of phenomenon that this thing that exists in all the places where the left used to be. You substitute this strange politics of race and gender and ethnicity in place
in the place of where the working class used to be. And you essentially eliminated class politics.
Yeah.
Entirely.
Yeah, that's so weird, eh? Because,
isn't that?
Well, I know. So one of the things that, because I thought about the postmodern influence on modern day politics as being a metastasis of Marxism, but it's because what happened was the axis of economic oppression was replaced by a multidimensional structure of oppression, race, ethnicity, it can be multiplied without end. That's the intersectional axis. But the bizarre thing is, I think the place that you can make the most potent case for inequality and power, what would you say, power inequity, is actually on the economic dimension.
Of course.
So I'm no admirer of Marx, but if you're going to make a case for power corruption, the best place to make it is economically, is class, right? And the postmodern types who are pushing the intersect
rejected class
completely.
And is it because the workers have rejected them? The working people have refused to throw off the chains of capitalism and seize the means of production. Is it resentment? And I think to a large extent it is. When you look at the Frankfurt School and the evolution into Derrida and Foucault and all that kind of rubbish. The working people just, okay, we don't mind making a deal with the boss. We'll go on strike. We'll make a nuisance of ourselves. We'll burn down the company store if we have to. But at the end of the day, we got a contract. The boss does his thing. We do our thing. Everybody gets along. We don't need to seize the means of production.
Yeah.
And so the socialists go looking for a new vanguard, right? And then they come up with this thing, this strange, hydra-headed, ever-shifting
rainbow
deal.
Rainbow of oppression dimensions. Yeah.
And essentially what, I should say, I'm actually, if I may, my son asked me to say this. Thank you, my boy. He read your 12
Rules for Life, yeah.
You actually made a really important contribution in the lives of young men. I don't know very much about you and your work. I don't follow your stuff. You'll forgive me. But I do know that that's what you did. And I know that you his friends as well. They speak very highly of you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because they were abandoned. These are young, white, working class kids.
Yeah.
Right?
Ooh.
And nobody.
Nothing worse than them, especially if they're male.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then that's why they're drawn to you. Mm-hmm. Right? And I think, I'm quite serious about this. Well done.
Oh, thank you, sir. Yeah, well, it's, like I said, it's been a privilege. And yeah, well, I didn't actually start out aiming to speak primarily to disaffected young men. I mean, as a university professor in psychology department, most of my students were women because most of the students in psychology are women. And none of the women in my classes ever thought that I was speaking only to the men. What happened in part was that, well, you're pointing at part of it, is that the demographic that the left threw under the bus was working class male, right? So they're like out of the picture completely from boyhood onward. And then YouTube, which is where I'd put all my lectures from the University of Toronto and before I started the podcast, it's 80% male. So there was, a confluence of factors that made my work particularly popular among young men. There's more to it than that, because I also pointed out, I suppose, that there's reason to grow up and that the exciting things that happen to you in your life are a consequence of voluntarily adopting responsibility.